welcome to FYI. My name is John McCall.
And I'm Mary Ellen Yo. Thank you for joining us today.
We actually have a very, very interesting show.
What's on the show today, John?
Well, you always hear about tornadoes, you hear about hurricanes, you hear about floods, but who's behind the scenes that does this?
I don't know. Lots of people, I think, John. We're going to learn that. We're going to learn that today.
That's
we're going
right.
to have VOAD. Is this what? VOAD. So, viewers, stay tuned. We're going to. It's a culmination of a bunch of different organizations that are kind of behind. We've all heard of FEMA and MEMA, the federal agency in Massachusetts, MEMA.
But there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that are involved
that are really,
with Mass VOAD. That's really the meat and potatoes behind the scenes.
They are. What's, shall we introduce our guest first,
By
and
all
then we
means,
can
could you
explain
do
what
that?
VOAD is? So first, I'd like to introduce Kevin Hall.
Hi.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you for coming
Hey,
on.
Kevin,
It's
thanks
nice
for
to
coming
meet
on the
you.
show.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. Next, we have Louis Matnog. Hi, Louis.
How are you?
Thank you.
Thank you, Louis.
Matnog,
Thanks for
I
coming
know
on.
his name's easy to remember, huh?
Yeah.
And Chris Ferran. Thank you so
You're
much,
very
Chris,
welcome.
for coming
Hey, Chris,
on.
thanks for coming on.
Pleasure, absolutely.
So these guys do a plethora of services for people that have experienced some disasters. In Massachusetts, I believe it's just Massachusetts, but we'll learn about it. So shall we start right in, John? You ready to find out what VOAD is?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Let's go. Let's start picking on Kevin. Can we start on Kevin right
Since
now?
he's the
Let's start-
closest one? All
Yeah,
right, let's
we'll
go
start.
pick on Kevin.
Kevin, would you explain what VOAD is and what the acronym means?
Absolutely, and glad to be picked on.
Wait.
He hasn't seen anything yet.
Well, VOAD is Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. And it's the nonprofit sector of disaster relief. While you know of FEMA and MEMA, the emergency management, you also have the private sector. So Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster is many of the groups you may donate to already and so forth that are out there. And you have a national VOAD organization, you have state organizations, and locally you have community organizations active in disaster. So what this was is in 1969, there was a Hurricane Camille that came out, and there was a lot of terrible problems and people doing the same work, agencies, private agencies get in the way of federal officials and so forth. So National VOAD was created to organize everybody. So it's actually a coalition that includes all kinds of groups from Red Cross, Salvation Army, churches like
Southern Baptist.
there's so many of them, Southern Baptist, Scientology Church, there's the Catholic Charities, there's many more. There's basically everyone who deals with disaster is pretty much in VOAD. And also there's associate members that are businesses that also work in disaster relief. So all this basically unites together in order to, prepare in advance, to go out and respond to emergencies, and finally to do the long-term disaster relief, the rebuilding of homes and things like this that you really don't see in the news.
So who calls VOAD? How would you get involved? Say there was flooding. Flooding was a recent, right? So how, can we just walk through something, how you get involved in that, whoever wants to?
It's more on about the interagency coordination. VOAD is activated when MEMA activates the bunker, the operation center. So that's the timeline of putting up VOAD. And then,
Yeah, I mean, essentially what happens, you can imagine how chaotic a disaster is anyway. And as Kevin was saying, with that earlier event, everyone wants to help, and those that went through the recent events in Massachusetts and those anywhere that have gone through a disaster can relate to the chaos, how to figure things out. So this was an idea of saying, responding during the disaster is not the best time to figure things out. So how do we get these people talking? For instance, both the Salvation Army and the Red Cross do feeding. We have our emergency feeding vehicles that go through neighborhoods. A long time ago it would have been like, well, maybe they're feeding the same group or not the same group. Again, this is one example of many. But how do we help work together so that the people in need are receiving the best care possible, the best service possible?
Now, how do you get deployed? I mean, there's a national disaster, as you mentioned, the tornado hits a town like, for example, like Springfield and Munson. How do they know who to deploy? I mean, how's the process go?
And it's a great question. And it really does vary depending on the disaster. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about some of the disasters. It was fascinating. It's always tragic to hear about disasters, but hearing a lot of people think, well, Florida, Texas, California with their wildfires, we're in old Massachusetts. This last year obviously was not that case, but historically there's been a lot of events. So it really does depend on the event. With the tornadoes, that was so sudden that basically everyone, in the same way a fire department receives a call and starts deploying and responding, The Massachusetts Emergency Management did the same thing. The tornado happens, all of a sudden everyone's called in, beepers are going off like crazy. Everyone goes in the ops room with the huge screens and phones are going crazy and all the desks are being filled. We had someone from VOAD that was sitting at the desk doing support. So basically people from the community started to say, well, how can I help? I have donations, I have these services, I have these people. And so they would contact our representative at MEMA, and then we then would contact the other partners that are out in the field and go from there.
A lot of other things we do too is when we're in, like during the tornado, all of a sudden emergency management is in trouble and they're like, we need hundreds of tarps, we need plywood, we need all these water all over the place. So we start calling up all the businesses. And in the preparation section, what we do is first line up who has resources for what. So when something hits, we know exactly what to do. And as you mentioned too, what do you do locally on something like this when an emergency happens? How can I help? Well, you have the national and state volunteer organizations active in disaster, but locally you have community organizations active in disaster, which are very important to set up and one of the main reasons why we're here, because that's your local businesses, your local fraternity groups, your local nonprofits. So what you do is meet in advance and work out if something happens, what can you do?
That's a COVAD?
COAD, Community
Okay.
Organizations Active in
Another way
Disaster.
that's recently being described is as a regional VOAD. We're trying to figure out to keep the language similar. I think a good example, Kevin mentioned it before, but you have FEMA at the federal level, MEMA at the state level, and then you have your local emergency manager in a town. In the same way you have national VOAD, Massachusetts VOAD, and then these regional VOADs where you have people, just in Springfield, for instance, you have churches, all the lists that Kevin made earlier. You have these different groups that bring incredible resources that the federal government and state government do an incredible job. Our first responders do an incredible job, but they only have a specific focus. And they're not going to have a warehouse of mattresses or blankets or food, things like that. So all these partners work together to go
Can
through
we
that.
talk about some of the disasters in the past 100 years? Like, it's hard for me to think about them. I mean, I know the flood was 2 years ago, but
Sure.
what were some of the local disasters that have happened? And can we talk about that, Lois,
Yeah.
a little
Well,
bit? Just so we-
recently, you can give some of them away.
Yeah, we'll start with 1919.
19.
That was
We're going
the
back to
year.
100 years.
100 years.
That was a good year.
He's old.
Yeah.
It's recent.
He's
Yeah,
old.
I'm
He's
sure-
been
I'm sure
around.
you
He
remember,
looks good,
John.
though, Kevin. Doesn't he look good?
I was not born at that
Oh,
time.
all
Yeah,
right.
so it's January 15, 1919. It's all about the molasses flood and the fermentation, a sudden rise in temperature, and an inadequate tank containing 2 million gallons of molasses exploded. Imagine the
that would be-
explosion.
In Boston.
In Boston.
Oh,
Flooded,
I never
flooded
heard
the
of
streets
that.
of Boston.
Yeah, it killed several people. Yeah.
21 people were killed.
21
Imagine
people
dying
killed.
in molasses, John.
Yeah.
That's a sticky mess.
You want to talk about 1936?
Yeah.
1930.
Because we're
Well,
moving at the timeline.
we put this timeline. Like I said, it was fascinating to learn not only the disasters that have happened. It's a horrible thing. I think you do have to be a little bit odd in the head to want to be a part of emergency management, and I can speak for them that they are. But
Thank you so much.
As are you, too. We're not immune
I've
from
had
this.
that as
It's
well.
contagious,
I'm just
right?
kidding. But going back, the Long Island Express in 1938, there was a huge hurricane, and it basically came all the way up the coast of the eastern coast, 138 miles an hour, 700 people killed in 6 hours,
Wow.
2,000 people injured, $400 million in 1938 dollars. So going back again, we're fortunate that we don't have a hurricane season that every single year, like Florida or some of those places. But these events do happen, and I think it's easy to forget that if we're not prepared, we're going to kind of make the same mistakes, and a lot of people aren't going to have the services they need. But
Yeah, what happened, by the way, in that one, in 1938, was it basically pulled the ocean right in and covered houses totally, and houses started floating out to sea.
Wow.
And
Is that similar to a
How-
tsunami?
it's called the surge. So it's different in the sense of what causes it.
tsunami
It's
is
technically
generally
a
from an
hurricane.
earthquake.
So
Right. But the impact can be very similar when you have that wall of water.
Water.
I mean,
Wow.
Good, Lois. We love
Yeah.
hearing about disasters, don't we? We do, huh?
well, and not all disasters are the same. The impact, the capacity of the people, and then the response process, it's not all the same. It has a variant of different work processes involved in disaster management.
And then I think a lot of people remember the Worcester tornado. People that have been in New England for a long time. That was in, I think, 1958.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
correct.
1953 rather. And that was 1,300 injured, 90 people killed, $52 million in damage. And I remember actually hearing that because of the sound, people hadn't experienced something like that before. The sound and the impact, people that didn't see the tornado, some people were actually calling their senator saying, we believe that there's been a nuclear attack because of
freaky,
the
yeah.
damage. It was so overwhelming at that time. And I mean, that was only 50, 60 years ago. And it was massive.
1978, we got a big hit with the blizzard.
The blizzard,
February
that's
10
right.
and June 10. On February 10th, that was the blizzard of 1978. Imagine that we had a 24 to 38 inches of the white stuff, immobilizing the infrastructure and blocking major interstate highways.
Yeah, in Boston actually had 24 inches, and it was followed by a storm of 29 inches within a week. So it piled on each other.
Yeah.
So
So
never
I
a
made
dull
money as an
moment.
18-year-old shoveling out cars.
A lot of snow.
I was deployed on that for the National Guards. We were called out for down Riviera Beach to take people out of the homes, and it was unbelievable. I've never seen anything like that.
Yep.
And then the cost for 1978 blizzard is about $1 billion.
1 billion.
Wow, see how expensive it's
Wow.
getting, right?
Because there was also the flooding then later.
Flooding later.
So even months
Oh,
later.
when it melted, you mean? When the snow melted?
Yep, the impact is still there and ends up impacting more houses.
It's all about the cause and effect, when you get this white stuff, it dries and water.
Gotta go somewhere.
yeah,
You have to
yep.
put it somewhere.
And that's probably the key in New England. The biggest disasters we really have are flooding after a hurricane, after a storm, after snowstorms. And along with that, power outages like we had in October last year with the early snowstorm in October of 2011. Also, Vermont is hit heavily with floods, and it went over to New York, even up to Canada. As the snow melts or water comes down after a hurricane from the mountains, and it just floods out low-lying areas. So there's a lot of work needed in getting mold out of houses and things like this.
Mold, yeah.
Because insurance doesn't cover everything. So.
Right, you have the emergency response phase, and we can get into that a little bit later, those different pieces. But I think there was the movie The Perfect Storm that Hollywood made incredible, and 10 people were killed.
Is that the Hurricane Grace?
Which one was called? I'm not sure if
No,
it was
it's a
Hurricane.
different one.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
it's
Yeah.
1991, October 29 to 31st. That was the perfect storm that they called.
Yep.
Yeah, so basically, you had the dying out hurricane come up with another
Oh, the
different
sea's
temperature, a lower pressure, and then
just
everything mixed together.
enveloped on them.
Well, and even just to show, again, the variety of disasters, I think that whenever I do a training, one of the first things I talk about is defining disaster. Because for a lot of people, it means this epic, sweeping thing, like the tsunami in Japan or the earthquake in Haiti. But sometimes it's like the warehouse fire that was in Worcester, where 6 firefighters lost their lives. And it doesn't even have to be this geographical area, but the impact, it's this crisis point where people are affected. There's a Newton bus crash where a number of children, I think,
It's 30, injuring more than 30 people.
yep, 4 children were killed. And as we talk about this planning, the emergency spans all the way from a bus crash where children are killed, all the way to a fire where firemen are killed, all the way to a tornado that rips apart a whole
Yeah, I think one of our
town.
key messages here is to get involved locally in the community, because when disaster hits, the first line of going into handling a disaster is the local community, the local emergency management, the local groups, if they're set up and organized to help. That's what we'd like to see more of. And what happens is often it gets too large for the local community. Then you call in the state level resources and groups. That gets too large, like for example down in Hurricane Katrina, then people come in nationally, and like a lot of people in Massachusetts and other volunteer organizations active in disaster groups around the country went down to help in Katrina because that was so huge, for example. And also it goes international, as a lot of us have gone to Haiti and Japan and Sri Lanka and a lot of other places during these disasters.
Let's take it to the local level. If someone listening tonight and watching this program, they want to get involved, how can they get involved with Mass VOAD?
Well, the first thing I want to make a point of, and we had some recent trainings out in the western part of Massachusetts because of all the activity recently and people wanting to be involved in. We had some terrific first responders, which is the fire department, police department, showing up. And it really is important that you have a plan. That when you want to be involved, if we're going to talk a little bit about personal preparedness later, and that's important. You have to do that first for your family. But then if you do want to be involved, you do need to be linked up in the proper channels and networks. And we never want to get in the way of the first responders. We never want to hinder someone else doing their job. So a lot of it is, with this VOAD, we offer some basic resources to help a community build a COAD or a regional VOAD where business partners can get together. We can help them develop a structure, build a program, even if it's 4 or 5 groups. saying, we want to start here. You start to build a list of what resources you have, and then you can go and coordinate with your emergency manager and say.
So you should work with your local emergency management first and say you want to get involved, and then you come into the picture and train everyone? Is that what you're saying?
It depends on the process, because as the community-based needs of the people in a disaster, it all varies. But the best way to do is, inform your local emergency management and connect with them, because it's a community-based process that we are linking all the different folks and different, vendors and all the agreements which must be in place. So it would be a good segue for those folks within a particular community that they can manage their own needs.
And also, what's important too with emergency managers, often sometimes it's someone in the fire department, it's a part-time job. So we don't want you to go out and harassing them. We need to get with you, we need to get with you. The idea is get with your neighbors in business groups and so forth and set up things you can do. Once you have a group together, then you may want to call in emergency management, then he's got
like
a
a
group of
neighborhood
resources.
watch or something.
Exactly.
And let me add to that. Part of it is, I think there's a lot of people that want to help but don't have the template. Mass VOAD can help with a structure, with a template, with training tools. I would recommend go to our website, and we'll put that information up a little bit later.
What is the website, since you mentioned that?
It is massvoad.org, M-A-S-S-V-O-A-D.
It's right on the screen right now.
As you see on the screen,
massvoad.org. So for viewers, Google that, massvoad.org.
Yeah.
Just
For those of
kinda-
you who are still staying on the program, because you're not going to need a computer right away and leaving.
Oh.
But when
Yeah,
you
good, Kevin.
when you go on
Like
though,
that.
Using your
it
tablet.
has data on preparedness and training, so you can learn how to do disaster relief and see where trainings are. It has information on recent events, and it gives a whole organization of volunteer organizations active in disaster
That's a good
in
idea, to just get
Massachusetts.
community, right, just get it going.
Well, I'll give you an example. Again, we're talking about Western Mass. There's a lot of churches and businesses and individuals who want to help. So we created this forum. And first responders, police department, fire department, faith-based agencies, emergency response, we came together and we shared our different perspectives. And then we said the next step is now get some people in your community to decide on a time to meet. Go through some of the tools we have on our website where you can set up this board and this committee. Because I'll say emergency managers, as Kevin said, often they're wearing multiple hats. So we want to be able to do as much as we can in our own group and then go to them and share what we've developed, what our protocol is, with maybe one contact person. So it's a way to streamline. So the next step in Springfield is we had that first meeting. Now we're going to meet as a regional group and say, all right, who has what, who needs what training? Because there's some great training out there. Get your people trained. There's stuff you want to know about before you show up at the disaster, even sometimes before you call the fire department. So there's good stuff out there. So we want to learn, we want to develop and build. But without people in the community, there's no way that we can do the work we need. I mean, there's still work happening from Springfield that's taking place right now.
Another thing too is we want people to know what they can do to help themselves and their own families and to really be prepared for pretty much anything. And you have some of that information, right, Larry?
Yeah. And it's more on the collaboration between the community to address the needs of the people. Because as I've said earlier, that the disaster starts on your own neighborhood, and who's the first one who will help you? It's the neighbors itself.
Can we break down a disaster and just kind of walk through the components of it? Like who's going to, what are you going to do? What's the time frame? Like what would VOAD or what would your organization do, Louis? Can we just kind of talk about that a little bit? I don't think I have a clue about what would happen.
Specifically for the Red Cross, we have our own table in MEMA. It's called ESF 6, Shelter Operations and then the Needs of the People.
ESF is Emergency Support
Emergency
Functions.
Service
MEMA
Function.
has
Yeah.
18 of those.
And VOAD is
For
under
the-
the ESF 15, which is a volunteer organization that collaborates with the other interagency coordination to support the needs of the community.
Yeah, so in there, for example, you'll have different organizations like National Guard will be in the room. You'll have our group, you'll have medical, you have
Transportation.
all kinds of things. So basically what happens is a disaster hits, local emergency management is trying to handle it, they need help. They call into state emergency management, which would be MEMA in Massachusetts, of course. So they get the call and then they look at the resources around the room, who's going to handle it. So maybe they'll ask volunteer organizations active in disaster to find the supplies needed.
What
And then
kind of
they'll-
supplies? Can we just kind of?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, tarps for
Blankets.
roofs, water, whatever is
Food,
needed.
diapers.
Depends on the
Food,
emergency.
Oh.
Or medical supplies, what have you. And then they'll have maybe the National Guard take their trucks out and deliver it. Or protect an area in a case there's looting or something like that, they may be working on that. So it all coordinates local up to the state level, and then when it gets really large, of course, then it goes federal.
We might open up a shelter, and then we might ask a collaborative effort with Salvation Army to feed the folks in the shelter, something
And
like that.
you're involved with the Red Cross. It's like the Red Cross is Be Ready. I mean, Be Red Cross Ready. You actually have some information on that.
Yeah.
So
So
maybe I can hold that up and you
Yep.
can talk a little bit about that if you can.
yeah, that's the Be Red Cross Ready. Get a kit, so you can be proactive in dealing with disasters. Water, then make a plan also for the family and be informed. So those three main things that needs to geared up when proactive measure needs to be done in the family and then in the neighborhood. And then I also have different sets of Red Cross Ready during fire prevention, winter storm, pets in disaster, because this is also very important. Heat wave, safety precautionary measures. And it's not only the Red Cross have this information. MEMA, have all of those information. FEMA, VOAD also collaborates.
Yeah, when
with
you
all
go to
of those individuals.
massvoad.org, it links all the different organizations on all the preparatory information that they have, all the different types of services they do.
And what would need to be prepared as just a
Exactly.
regular
So what's some of the
citizen.
things you would need in the house,
Yeah, for example, like Salvation Army. What would,
Well, we do some of the similar preparedness because as the coordinator for the state, I know the first thing is you need to take care of yourself. You need to make sure that you and your family are prepared, that you have the right resources in your home. Simple things like a gallon of water per person per day. You want to have canned food. As a camper, I have a stove that I can use. You have to think about if your power goes out. Generators, small portable generators, are a very valuable thing. With the recent fluke snowstorm that we had in October, power was knocked out for a week, and there were elderly and disabled and people that couldn't even leave their home.